Okay, today we're going to start into chapter 7, which basically covers ancient India and moves us from India into China, early China as well. So, in the Han Dynasty of China. So, that's what we're going to take a look at. Today, we're going to look at the first empire of India, which is called the Mauryan Empire. We'll talk about when it was established and how. So, capital letter A talks about the introductory period here. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Indus Valley region. We knew that Alexander the Great had invaded that region. I also taught you back in chapter 5 that Alexander came up against a really strong army in India. They had war elephants, and he was injured and almost killed in battle there. So if you can kind of remember that, this is kind of linking that in also. Around 321, an Indian military leader named Chandragupta Maurya came to power and set up what's called the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryan Empire was the first empire in India. It was founded by Chandragupta Maurya in 321 BC. This empire united both northern India and the surrounding regions of the Indus Valley for the first time in history. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Chandragupta Maurya unifies North India. He did this mostly through a powerful army. His army was made up of about 600,000 soldiers. That is huge for the ancient times. I mean, that's a very large amount of foot soldiers. It had an additional 30,000 cavalry. That's troops on horseback. And they employed or deployed 9,000 elephants into war. That's a massive army, guys. To pay for all of this, of course, the government had to levy high taxes. When you levy taxes, that means that you regulate taxes, you introduce taxes. That's what that means. Capital C is talking about how they ran the empire. Chandragupta had a very key advisor named Kautilya. Kautilya was known as a very bright advisor, and he wrote a book called the Arthasastra, which was basically a book about how to be a ruler. It's a ruler's guide that proposed tough-minded policies to hold the empire together. The system underneath these two leaders created 4 provinces, each controlled by a royal prince. Each province was then divided into local districts that are run by officials. We've seen this throughout our course of history. We know that the Persians did this, the Assyrians did this. So many groups have done something similar. Capital D will talk about the difference between in India in life in the city and life in the countryside. En route to creating his empire, Chandragupta had to battle Seleucus, who was one of Alexander's former generals. Seleucus or Seleucus wanted to keep a good standing with Chandragupta, and he sent an ambassador for the purposes of diplomacy, negotiations, talking, things of that nature, named Megasthenes. Megasthenes recorded what he witnessed about city life and country life in writing. And so that's kind of where we take an understanding from what was going on in India during this time period. Capital E talks about Ashoka promoting Buddhism. Ashoka was Chandragupta's grandson. He became king in 269 BC and brought the empire to actually its greatest strength. After leading a war against a region called Kalinga, in which 100,000 soldiers were killed, Ashoka felt sorrow and turned to the practice of Buddhism. One major teaching of Buddhism was peace to all people, and this became a policy of Ashoka from that point on. One of the things he also started to do was practice religious toleration. This is the acceptance of people who held different religious beliefs. It's something that Cyrus the Great did way back in Persia. He allowed for different groups to have their own political and religious beliefs and customs. After Ashoka's death in 232 BC, the empire generally began to falter. And we see this throughout history, that when you have a strong ruler, after they sort of go out of power or pass away, that empire generally doesn't stay around for very much longer. Roman numeral 2 is going to talk about a period of turmoil, and we'll talk about the introduction here. Throughout India, there actually was a lot of conflict, including war, migrations in and out, invasions in and out, and political instability. These are some things that can really cause a lot of problems. They're not entirely bad. Like immigration isn't entirely bad, but what it does is it causes a mixing of people, which can lead to conflict. Invasions are in general bad. I mean, if you're invading someone, you're killing people. You're not really doing something that we would see as morally correct. Sometimes you have to do it for survival, but if you're getting invaded, that's never. Oh, hey, we're getting invaded. That's not something that's fun. Political instability, always problematic. It's still problematic today. Roman numeral 3 talks about a second empire that gets established called the Gupta Empire, which is created by Chandra Gupta. No relation to Chandragupta Maurya, but very confusing, but yet the same name, two totally different families, okay? He formed India's second major empire, no relation to Chandragupta Maurya, by the way. The Gupta Empire was started by Chandra Gupta, and it ushered in a flowering of Indian and also Hindu culture. Talk about building of this empire. Chandragupta gained status as leader through marriage instead of warfare, so totally different there. And that happened in the year 320 AD. His power base was along the Ganges River and included the region of Magadha. His son Samudra came to power in 335. He was a lover of art, but he also did have a warlike side and actually used conquest to expand the empire. Let's talk a little bit about daily life in India. Most people lived in small villages and worked as farmers, craftspeople, and merchants. The society was basically patriarchal. This is a key term that means that the family was led by the eldest male. That's what patriarchal means. When you talk about the patriarch of your family, that would be the oldest male in your family. Drought was common in the region, and families had to produce their own crops, so that made it really difficult. Irrigation was definitely necessary, and therefore people had to provide at least 1 day per week of labor for the government system on irrigation wells, ditches, reservoirs, and dams, all things related to water supply and irrigation. People also had to pay on top of that work heavy taxes, including a tax on water. You had to pay a tax on water. You think water is free today. It's not. You pay a water bill. You have to pay your city. I live in Novi, so I have to pay a city bill for water, quarterly, something like that. So water is definitely not free. If you want it filtered and running to your home through pipes, you have to pay for that. In southern India, the culture was based on the Tamil people who did things a little bit differently. The Tamil had, in the south, a matriarchal society. Now, matriarchal is the exact opposite of patriarchal. A matriarchal society is where families are headed by the eldest female. So you might at a family gathering go and say, I wonder who the patriarch of our family is. Find the oldest male in the family, and that's generally your patriarch, especially if they're in a leading position. And if you're looking for the matriarch, that would be the oldest female, okay? Now, capital D talks about the height of the Gupta Empire. Another great ruler was Chandragupta II, who ruled from 375 to 415. He defeated enemies to the west known as the Shakas, adding their coastal territory in India to his empire. That's really important because that's going to increase what we know as of Indian Ocean trade. So if you're talking about the western portion of India, trading across the Indian Ocean would be to Saudi Arabia and Africa. This win led to valuable trade with, as I just mentioned, the Mediterranean region. He also used diplomacy to expand the empire. Diplomacy is using marriage or trade or land negotiations, things of that nature, instead of warfare. That's what diplomacy is really talking about. The empire did come to an end around 535 due to invasions by what the Indian people called the Hunas, which are actually relatives of the Huns. So a very similar name, along with other Central Asian nomadic groups, such as the Mongols later on. Okay, I do want to pause. Okay, so I had to pause and I wanted to pull up an important map on India. So this is basically what we're talking about with the Gupta Empire right here. The Mauryan Empire was much larger. You can see that the Mauryan Empire, which was the first one, came all the way out here and with these purple lines down into the south here. So this would be sort of more the Tamil region down in the south. You can see that up here you've got the Ganges River and the Indus River Valley. This is where kind of civilization begins in India, and then it spreads elsewhere. This is the Tamil kingdoms right down here in this lighter purple color. And then this is areas that were what are called under the Gupta influence. So they didn't generally control them per se, but they had an influence on them through trade and cultural diffusion. So this is kind of the area of India that we're talking about. This is the Indian Ocean down this way. So trade coming from India to Saudi Arabia, which would be kind of over in this range, and then also Africa, and then the Mediterranean region, which would be up in this region here. So that's a little bit of the geography of what we were just talking about throughout that lesson. Thank you.